Yeah, what you're used to is seeing wood with a layer of plastic on top. And this finish, it may look like it's not sealed or protective because you're missing that film layer that most people are familiar with. But just understanding that no, it's sealed, it's protected, it's locked in into the wood, and it provides a lot of nice benefits.
Welcome to the talk. And why don't you let everybody know kind of a little bit about yourself and a little bit about Rubio Monocoat?
Sure, yeah. So my name is Dave Hansen. Been with Rubio Monocoat for a little bit over 3 years now. Our primary product is the one we're going to be talking about today, which is Oil Plus 2C. The basic concept with that is it's a one coat finish where you get stain and finish in a single coat. It's a zero VOC product, so it's really clean for you to apply, really clean for your customers to have in their house. And it's just very simple, like highlights the natural qualities of the wood very nicely, gives you a good look and feel, so you know you've got real hardwood there. It's a great product.
Awesome. So I guess the first thing to start off when we talk about these kinds of products is probably to define a little bit what they are. When it comes to finishes on a floor, we've got surface finishes, and those are like the polyurethanes and things that sit up on top. And then you have the penetrating finishes, which are like the anything from natural oils to waxes to hard wax oils, which I think is the category you guys fit into. So, um, how does a finish like Rubio Monocoat differ from a typical polyurethane? Like if a contractor was going out to a homeowner and they're wanting to sell a product like Rubio, what's the best way they could explain to the homeowner the difference?
Sure, yeah. So if you think about a polyurethane, you've got a film forming finish. So you're going to have your wood down there, and then you're going to have that coating over the top, which gives it real nice, solid, good protection. If you're comparing that to our finish, ours is going to penetrate into the wood. It's going to bond with the cellulose fibers of the wood and then harden internally and stop penetrating. So if you're comparing it to penetrating oils, our product is going to stop penetrating after that initial application. So it essentially locks all the protective qualities in that top inner layer of the wood. And if you're comparing it to polyurethanes, instead of having that protective finish sit on top of the wood, it is inside. So you get more of a natural look, a natural feel because they're actually interacting with the wood. It's not just a layer on top. So from a how do you explain it to customers? It does help to have them understand that, yeah, what you're used to is seeing wood with a layer of plastic on top. And this finish, it may look like it's not sealed or protective because you're missing that film layer that most people are familiar with. But just understanding that no, it's sealed, it's protected, it's locked in into the wood, and it provides a lot of nice benefits. Makes it much easier to repair down the road, much easier to keep that surface maintained and looking good. So if you have a customer that's sort of a set it and forget it person that doesn't want to do any type of maintenance, they want as low maintenance as possible, maybe Rubio's not the right option for them. Someone who wants their floors looking consistently good and doesn't mind calling their contractor up in 3 to 5 years and saying, hey, can we make my floor look like new again? Those are kind of some ways to navigate which finish is right for which customer and which project.
Let's get into the oil from like the contractor's perspective. We talked a little bit about some of the differences, and by the way, that's one of the things I love about like a Rubio is when you put it in, you still feel the texture of the wood. It doesn't feel like a sheet of plastic. But along with that, and other differences, you get a pretty different application. I know that like hard wax oils, well, penetrating oils have been around a long time, and hard wax oils have been around a while too. They're getting, seems like they're getting more popular in the U.S. So probably more contractors have a little bit more experience with them now than like when I first put it down. But it's going to be quite a bit different when the contractor goes to actually apply it on the floor. So let's start with the sanding. Like, how would a contractor sand a floor to accept Rubio? Is there going to be any differences between that and a poly?
Yeah, there are some differences. So, for the most part, because you're dealing with a substrate where it's not going to be filling in all on top of any potential um, sanding imperfections, it's filling those in. You really need to do a premium sanding job. So if you're thinking about how you're allotting time on a job, you're going to spend a little more time making sure you have a really clean, high quality sanding job. And then you'll save some time on the back end where, because you're only doing one coat, so you'll spend a little more time on the wood prep. You'll spend more time on that application of an individual coat, but you typically will save time overall on the job because you're not going back for the next day to do your final coats or whatnot. So you kind of want to think of it almost like how you would sand a floor to accept like a dark stain. You know that sanding marks, the dark stain's going to show it. So you want to think like that. And so you want to have as clean a sanding job as possible. People will often ask, can you water pop? Should you water pop your floor? That's totally up to you. You certainly can water pop, and a lot of people choose to because it makes it a little easier on your sanding. Doesn't have to be quite as perfect if you water pop, but you will also certainly get a lot more pigment in there. So whichever way, whether you water pop or not, definitely make sure that you get your sample approved with whatever method you plan to actually apply it on the floor, because there can be a pretty noticeable difference between the appearance of a water popped floor versus not.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that's a really good thing to highlight. Also, especially since it's soaking into the grain of the wood, um, the grit that you end on, or even just the grit sequence overall, is probably going to matter a lot when it comes to color, correct?
Yeah, correct. So we recommend sanding to 120 grit. You really don't want to go above that. It will kind of start to close off the pores there. But if you had a floor sanded to 80 grit, 1 to 100, and 1 to 120, the 80 grit's going to be the darkest, the 120 is going to be the lightest. It will dictate how much pigment is accepted into the wood and how the color intensity turns out. So your sanding will definitely make a difference as far as the amount of color that your floor has.
Okay, so you said you recommend ending at like 120 grit. Is that still true when you talk about a lot of planetary machines out there? Like a lot of guys are using Norton mesh power or other ceramic papers that tend to close off the grain a little bit more, especially on a planetary machine. So, do you want to recommend those guys end at about 120 or 100, or does it matter between the two?
Well, it will obviously make a little bit of a difference. If you're using one of those machines that does kind of close it off a little bit more, that's a scenario where it might make sense to water pop afterwards just to kind of open it back up again so you're getting enough of that oil in there. What you run the risk of if you close it off too much is just not getting enough oil into the wood to protect it fully. It's going to be a little more susceptible to spills and things if you don't have enough oil in there protecting the floor. So you'll never. The problem is sanding too fine in those type of scenarios. If you sand lower, your performance is going to be fine. It's just a question of if the floor is uh, clean enough, basically, at lower grits. So you don't have any problem with the protection if you sand to a lower grit. It just doesn't look the way you want it to.
Okay, gotcha. So, are there any techniques a guy might try to know that he's gotten, I guess, enough oil into the wood? I would assume on the low side it'd be pretty easy to tell just because you're feeling fairly rough wood, like wood you wouldn't want to walk around on, but or wood that's hard to clean. On the high grit side, is there any technique you'd give to a guy to make sure, like if he's making a sample, that he hasn't gone too far in the sanding sequence?
There's really not a great way to tell just from um, just by the look or the feel. It's really about the water permeability. So once it's cured, you could kind of tell if the water's beating up, if you're not getting watermarks left on it after the water kind of evaporates or dries up. But from before it's cured standpoint or from a visual standpoint, yeah, there's not really a great test on that. But the
Okay.
120 grit is a pretty good. I mean, that is what we recommend. So if you're ending at 120, and that should be fine.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And even if you're making samples, the water bead test is a really good idea after they've cured. Um, all right, we've sanded the floor and we're on our A game with sanding. So we blended everything together, and we're ready to coat the floor. So what's a guy going to do when he coats the actual floor?
Yeah, so after you have the floor sanded, you want to get all the dust off the floor. So you have two options there. If you're going to water pop the floor, you can just water pop, damp tack the floor. Once it's fully dry, it's ready to apply the oil. If you don't want to pop the grain, you can use our raw wood cleaner, where you're basically going to damp tack the floor with the raw wood cleaner. That will electrostatically suck all the dust off the floor without opening up the wood grain,
Okay.
and it just really preps the floor to accept the oil. So we'd recommend you. It's critical to get all the dust off the floor because of the nature of how our product bonds to cellulose fibers and wood. You don't want it just bonding to dust that happens to be there. You want it bonding to the actual hardwood. So once you got the surface sanded and prepped clean of any sawdust, essentially typically do the perimeters first. So if you're, let's say you water pop the floor, a lot of guys will choose to apply the oil with a red pad if they want to knock that wood grain down a little bit. But you can apply it
Hmm.
with either a red or a white pad. If you're doing it with the red pad, you basically start and do the perimeter first. So if you get the puck out of the center, use the same type of pad for the perimeter as you would the main floor. Work in the edges. You want to make sure you get it on and off within a 10 to 15-minute time window. So when you're doing the perimeter, don't get too far ahead. If you got one guy applying and one guy ragging it off, kind of stay together so you're not too far. One's not too far ahead of the other.
Gotcha.
Set the perimeter first, and then once you do that, you're going to work your way out of that room. uh, Typically you do about 50 square feet at a time, maybe 100 square feet at a time, but especially if you're new to using Rubio, start small in the areas that you're doing. That way you can kind of get your process dialed in. If you're pushing it past that 15-minute time window of buffing it on, buffing it off, the product will start to set up on you and it will be harder to remove the excess product. So
Hmm.
essentially, set your perimeter, work it in around the edges, wipe it off within 15 minutes. Then
Yeah.
when you get to do the main run of the floor, you're basically going to buff it into the floor 50 square feet at a time roughly with either a red or a white pad. Once
Okay.
you buff it in, set that pad aside. You can save that pad to continue the application process. From there, you're going to want to get a clean white pad. Buff over what you did. That will remove the majority of the excess oil off the floor.
Yeah.
And then lastly, you're going to go over. Once you do that, that pad is toast. You could flip it if you want. You will get some oil on the bottom of your driver if you flip the pad, but if you want to get an extra removal out of it, you can flip the pad. But then you're going to put some terry cloth towels underneath and buff over what you just did to make sure all the excess oil is removed. That is probably the number one thing that people do wrong on the application side is either two things. They don't pay enough attention to getting a really good clean sanding job. Maybe they just do kind of a quick and dirty sanding job because they're in a rush. Well, it's going to show in the final product. If your sanding's not on point, you will see it. The other thing is not removing all the excess. If you don't remove the excess, essentially what you'll have the wood surface that has the oil correctly penetrated, bonded, and cured. And then you'll have a thin layer on top that, because it's not interacting with cellulose fibers, it's not going to cure correctly. It'll dry, it'll harden, but it will remain tacky. It'll attract dirt and dust. You will have an unhappy customer. So
Yeah.
that's a point of failure if you don't get all the excess product off. It should essentially, after you buff it in, buff it off, and then do a final pass with terry cloth towels underneath. It should feel basically dry to the touch. You shouldn't, if you run your hand across it, you should not be pulling up oil there. So
Okay.
that's a good test to make sure you've got all the oil off. Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, I guess a couple questions in there real quick. So you've done the edges, and I think if somebody hasn't used a product like this, they're going to get a little bit freaked out that once they've done the edges and wipe that off, they're going to get lap lines when they go into it with the buffer in the field. So I assume like you want to overlap on your edges quite a bit, and then when you come back with the white pad, it's going to remove everything. And that if your sanding was on point, those two should blend pretty seamlessly, correct?
Yeah, correct. So one of the unique things about our product is it only bonds to raw wood and it does not bond to itself. Hence the monocoat thing. If you do a second coat or you buff over what you've already coated, anything in addition to that is going to buff right off the top. So it's very easy to blend it together. You shouldn't get lap lines or overlap marks. So as you're doing, your edges, moving from this set of 50 square feet to that set of 50 square feet, you just kind of buff over what you already did, and it will blend in seamlessly. It makes it very easy to blend them in together. Like you said, as long as your sanding's good, it should blend very easily.
Okay, gotcha. And
Really don't
then
have to worry about overlap marks or
yeah, when it comes to the white pads, you said, those are going to be toast. Like, about how many square feet are you going to get out of the white pad? Just one 50-foot area, or is it going to go several 50-foot areas?
there's two places where you could use the white pad. If you're using a white pad on the initial application, that one you can set aside and continue to use that. That will probably get you at least 500 square feet, most likely more than that. But you'll start to see the pad kind of start to break down at some point. So once it does, get yourself a clean pad. Um, for the for the second step where you've already applied the oil and now you're starting to remove the excess oil, basically you get one pass over it, and then if you want to flip it, you can do another pass, but at that point it's done. So only one pass per side on that second step where you're removing the oil, because
And by
otherwise you're just going to be spreading oil around and not actually lifting it up.
Gotcha. Okay. And I assume you'll kind of get a feel for that because as you're going over it with the white pad, you'll see it leaving round buffer streaks in the floor as opposed to cleaning it off, right?
Exactly, yeah.
You're doing the edges, then you're doing the field, and then you're working yourself out in, let's call it 50 square foot blocks out of there. And you want the last thing to touch the floor to be the buffer with a terry cloth on there. So you want that to touch the floor and then work yourself out with that being the last thing.
Yeah, correct. Yep. So once you've done those three steps of buffing it on the floor, buffing it off, and then using a terry cloth towel as your final pass, at that point, you're done, and it's just give it 24 to 36 hours before you start walking on the floor and moving stuff back into the house. So at that point, that's it. Just that one coat, you're done. Give it a good 24 to 36 hours, and then you're ready to get back on the floor for light use.
After that 24 to 36 hours, you can tell the homeowner they can move everything back on the floor, or do they walk on it for a couple days? Like, what's the cure time that you can tell a homeowner to get back on the floor, or that they can even move back in?
Yeah, so you can start moving stuff back in after 24 to 36 hours. The floor will not be fully cured for a week, so give it a full 5 days before you do any type of wet maintenance. If you happen to spill something on the floor, wipe it up as soon as you can. So during that first week, you kind of want to go easy on the floor. After 48 hours, it's going to be 80% cured. So at that point, it's going to have a reasonably good amount of water resistance. You obviously still don't want stuff sitting on it for long periods of time, but if you spill, it's not a huge concern. I would wait a while before you put things like area rugs on the floor, but just moving in furniture, as long as do it properly, carefully, felt pads, all that good stuff, you can start moving furniture in after that, roughly 36 hours or so.
Okay, good deal.
Definitely tread lightly on it during that first 5 days while it's curing.
Okay, and then let's talk a little bit about maintenance on the floor. What would you tell a homeowner to do to clean the floor and then to maintain it and then also to wipe up those spills and clean spills?
Sure. So for everyday cleaning, you can sweep the floor as much as you want to. When it comes time for like wet maintenance, you can do that as often as you want, but at some point, less is more. So with damp mopping the floor, we recommend either using our soap concentrate or using just water, but not using off the shelf cleaners. Because our product is a natural product, I mean, the primary ingredients are linseed oil, beeswax, carnauba wax. A lot of those off the shelf cleaners are designed for polyurethane floors, and some of those have solvents, surfactants that can kind of break down the oil and wax in our product. So it is
Mhm.
critical that they can use water if they want, that's free, and they can use our soap, which is inexpensive, but they shouldn't use off the shelf cleaners. Typical everyday maintenance is sweep as much as you want, mop the floors as needed. Like I said, less is more. You don't really need to mop your floors every day. That's going to actually probably not be ideal. And then when it comes time to more long-term maintenance, we have a product called Renew, which that's a maintenance oil where it will blend in with the original sheen of the floor. So that can be done as necessary. We usually say reasonable expectations are in the 3 to 5 year range. Some customers may want to do the floor, may want to use Renew after 2 years if it's like a lot of traffic and they really just want their floors looking consistently good. But 3 to 5 years is pretty normal as far as doing a coat of Renew. For that product, because it blends in with the original sheen, you don't necessarily have to do the entire surface of the floor. If only the entryway needs it, you could just do the entryway. If you want to do some of the main high traffic areas, that's fine. But it should blend in pretty nicely, so you don't necessarily have to move all your furniture out. You can kind of work around it, and it does blend in nicely with the Renew.
Okay.
But that's what you're looking at. If, let's say, somebody's neglected their floors for a while and you start to see color loss where the traffic pattern maybe is in the high traffic areas, there's some color loss. At that point, if you want to restore the floor, you'd basically buff over the entire area with a maroon pad, clean the dust off of it, and then apply another coat of the original color of Oil Plus 2C. That
Hmm.
will restore the color to the floor, and allow you to get basically a brand new floor without having to resand it. So much lower intensity than having to resand and start from scratch. So the costs of maintaining it over time, you're looking at smaller chunks of maintenance that don't cost as much, aren't as invasive, but you're going to have to do those a little more frequently than say a polyurethane floor. But it gives the
Sure.
customers the option to have a new floor at a relatively low maintenance cost as opposed to resanding, starting from scratch, and having a big project that people just keep pushing off for, oh, we'll do it in a couple years because, who really wants to go through that?
Awesome. So then what about repairability? Let's say a contractor goes in and somebody's dropped something on a board or a couple boards or has a deep scratch and they need to do some board replacements. What does that look like with Rubio?
Yeah, so if you have to do something like a board replacement, one thing that's nice about how our product works is that it does make it a lot easier to repair because you don't have a film finish over the whole surface. If you just pop a board out, replace it. If you do that, you want to try to match your sanding grit sequence as close as possible. Sometimes that's a little bit challenging because you're doing it by hand and you don't have the full weight of a machine on there, but you want to try to match your sanding as much as possible. So it is wise to keep records of what your grit sequence was so that if you are going back a few years later, you can kind of remember what you did on that floor. But yeah, basically it makes board replacements a lot easier because you're not having to deal with a film coat on top.
Gotcha.
If it's minor scratches, a lot of those can possibly be done by just, getting a little sample bottle and kind of, if it's just a small surface scratch, kind of going over that area to kind of fill in the color that may have scratched off the surface. So if it's more minor in nature, you might be able to just do a quick little repair with a sample bottle and some maroon pad or something like that. If it's more invasive, like there's sanding that needs to be done, in that case, the board replacement is a nice option.
Because it only bonds to raw wood, can you sand into the boards next to where you're doing the repair, or would you recommend only sanding the board that you're repairing?
So it's a good idea to try basically just to do the board that you're repairing, kind of tape off the areas around it. What you want to avoid is kind of having a halo effect where there's usually there could be a sheen difference if you just sort of sand that area, and it blends into surrounding or adjacent boards. So that's kind of where the art of it comes in. Um, it is much easier to repair than other surfaces, but sometimes people, it's possible to kind of overestimate the ease of it. It still is an art to it. It's not magic. You kind of have to be careful as you're blending it in with what's around you. So it is best to kind of tape off those other boards so you don't get a little bit of a halo around your repair area.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Okay. So, the question I always ask is if a contractor was going to mess up Rubio, and we all find new and creative and fun ways to mess up products, what are the easiest pitfalls that a contractor could avoid with this?
Okay, sure. So there were a couple that I mentioned earlier, which was the sanding job. If you're skipping too many grits in between your sanding sequence, if you're just basically not doing a premium job of sanding, that that will show itself. That's a big error. The second error is not removing all the excess oil. You will get a call back if you have excess oil left on the floor. You're not going to take off too much, but you may take off not enough. So don't skip that last step of using a terry cloth towel to buff over the floor. Make sure you do that. If you're still pulling up oil, then maybe you have to buff over it one more time. It's better than the alternative of getting a call back and having to go back later to fix it. Um, the other thing is making sure that you inform your homeowner about the maintenance. If the homeowner's not cleaning the floor with the right stuff, it will damage it. You will break down the seal on the floor. That will happen if you're just grabbing something from Target or Home Depot and cleaning the floors with whatever. So I recommend giving your homeowner a small care and maintenance package. It could be as simple as a bottle of soap, maybe a small bottle, 100 milliliter bottle of Renew that they can kind of, if they see little scratches that annoy them, they can use that Renew on their own. If you feel comfortable giving it to them, it's a pretty safe product for small stuff like that. But those are the
Gotcha.
big things. If you have a maid or somebody who's cleaning the floors and they're just using whatever happens to be in their bag of tricks, you can run into problems.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. Awesome. Well, Dave, thank you for joining us. Thank you for giving us all the information about Rubio. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you're super welcome, Daniel. Anytime.
All right. Well, everybody, thanks for watching this Pro Shop Talk. Hope it's been helpful for you. Learn about Rubio and some of the tips behind how to put it down, and hopefully some of the differences between that and a conventional finish. So we will see you guys on the next video.